Hey folks, my name is John Thompson. I'm a software developer living here in St. Petersburg, Florida, and I'm the founder of Spring Framework Guru. So I've been in the field of IT for roughly 20 years, actually a little over 20 years. And the crazy part is I wasn't always a developer. There was a point in my career where I decided to switch into development. I actually started off as a project manager. I always worked on large enterprise scale applications and doing a lot of custom development, but I started my career so long ago, Java as a programming language didn't even exist. And I kind of laugh with my more seasoned colleagues that back in the days when we started, if you knew a little bit of Bash and SQL, you were quite the badass. And now, with there's so many technologies, and technologies has evolved and grown so much, there's a lot of complexity out there. We have some very deeply complex technologies, but a lot of great abstractions over top of them. And the Spring Framework is one great example of that. It takes a lot of very complex things, but gives you a very easy to use layer over top of it where you can rapidly build scalable applications in the enterprise. Now, I do run the website Spring Framework Guru, and that does not actually run Spring. I'm using PHP, WordPress and PHP for that. And in this case, it's perfectly fine because I'm never going to need the scalability that Spring would bring. I'm running a blog website, have a lot of informational content out there, and currently I see about 60,000 visitors on that site per month. And in that case, I don't need the scalability of a Spring website. Spring is used in applications where you're running a small server farm and you're seeing like 60,000 people per minute or per hour on the website. Much, much different ballgame. If my website ever gets there, that'd be a really nice problem to have, but I just don't see that happening no matter how much growth I have on springframework.guru. Now, over the years, Spring has been criticized for being overly complex and hard to configure and hard to work with. And to be honest, I've seen things evolved. And in the early days of Spring, there was a lot of complexity, but Spring actually evolved in a response to Java or J2EE, which is terribly complex. And Spring was a simpler alternative, and that philosophy has continued to Spring throughout the years, and it becomes simpler and easier to use, but also more robust. So while it's simpler and easier to use, you have a much more robust and larger framework to handle things with. One great addition to Spring has been Spring Boot, which allows you to automatically configure applications. In the old days of Spring, you had to wire up everything yourself. So if you wanted a database, like a very common database to use right now is H2 in-memory databases for local development, works out great. It gives you some great capabilities in developing things. But before Spring Boot, you'd have to add in that dependency yourself. You'd have to configure in that data source yourself. With the advent of Spring Boot is a Spring project, and it sees, oh, you've included H2 database, so you're probably going to want an in-memory database when you're running in development mode. So that it kind of makes sense that it makes these sensible choices for you to get you started off the ground. And what we're going to do right now is I'm going to toggle over and show you how easy it is to create a Spring Boot application. And we'll step through, we'll go out to start.spring.io, and we can pull down a pre-configured Spring project and get it up and running in just a matter of a few seconds. So I'm going to switch over to the computer now and create a project on startspring.io, and we'll pull that down, and we'll get a little whole world application going for our use. Okay, I've jumped over to Chrome, and I've gone to the website start.spring.io. This is Josh Long's favorite website in the world. If you know who Josh Long is, he's a technical advocate who works for Pivotal supporting Spring and lectures at conferences all over the world. Josh is a great guy. Highly respect him. Very, very smart guy. I've learned a lot from him personally myself. So this is a project generator, and we've got a couple options here. We can do Maven or Gradle. I'm going to stick with Maven right now. That's probably still the most widely used. And some people are going to say, oh, Gradle's the best. And I dig Gradle, don't get me wrong. But for simplicity's sake, right now, I'm going to stick with Maven. That's in the enterprise, that is probably the most used. But Gradle is getting some great popularity. So different world to work in. One is creates an XML build file, and Gradle uses Groovy, which I'm also a big fan of. So we are on a current release of Spring 1.4.2 as I'm recording this video. And you do want to watch as you go through my courses. I do have some 1.3 versions, and there are some incompatibilities there with some of my courses. But for our purposes today, the 1.4.2 version will be fine. And we're just going to do a little Hello World sample here. So I'm going to change this to Guru.Spring Framework, and we'll just say Hello World. And now what we can do here, I want to show you this as well. We can search for things and it'll come up. And let's see here. Oh, switch to the full version. So they keep evolving this interface, and it grows every time I look at it. So now we can get some further things. So we can do a little description here. So I can do Hello World from the Guru. Package name is standard, so reverse name of your website. A little trick in case you're recent to Java. Now here's a number of things. These are largely Spring Framework projects, so Spring Security, AOP, using AspectJ. So if we select web, that's going to bring in a Tomcat server, and we don't need that right now. There's actually a lot of stuff that we don't need. There's a lot of really cool projects here that are coming up, like mobile and Rust docs. That's actually a real cool project for documenting your Rust. FreeMarker and Velocity seems to have stopped evolving, so it looks like Spring is no longer supporting that. TimeLeaf is one of my favorite templating engines right now. You can do a lot of cool stuff with that. And now here's support for a number of different databases. So you have traditional SQL databases, as well as no SQL databases. And then we get into a lot of the Spring Cloud stuff. Cloud configuration, cloud discovery, circuit breakers. So there is just a ton of stuff going on in the cloud space, especially Cloud Foundry. If you need to build an application with Facebook or LinkedIn, here's plugins that we can use effectively to enable logins and security using those. I/O Batch, a good buddy of mine, is on the project there, Chris Schaefer. And then we also have Spring Integration, and Spring Integration is absolutely fantastic project. One of my favorites within the Spring Framework, seen a lot of growth in that. And this is all different things that we can be using, but we don't need to for Hello World. A lot of this would be overkill for Hello World yet project. So I'm just going to say generate project right now. And we can see that we get Hello World zip downloaded. And this is a whole setup of files, and self-contained. It has several Java classes, Maven POM in there, and we'll be able to go in and load this right into our IDE of choice. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead in the course a little bit, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that zip file, explode it out into a working directory. I don't think I need to show you that. If you can't take a zip file and unzip it into a working directory, you probably shouldn't be taking this course. So I'm going to jump ahead and not waste your time and get that set up, and then we'll open it up in IntelliJ and take a look at what's there. Okay, I've got IntelliJ up, and you're actually looking at a project that I'm working on right now. It's an API using Spring to talk to ConvertKit. That's the mail provider that I use to stay in touch with you guys. And I'm going to be doing some interesting stuff around there, and I wanted to be able to talk to their API. So I got a little project I am writing in Spring Boot, and we'll be using a lot of Spring goodness to interact with their RESTful API here in the future. And keep an eye on my GitHub account, and you'll be seeing me post further updates to that. But what we want to do right now is we want to open up a new project from existing sources. So I'm going to click on this, and I want to go down to my source directory. So I keep all my source in source, SRC, and I just have this sitting in temp, and here's my Hello World, and we can see that the Maven POM is there. So I am going to click OK. And we are doing a Maven project, and usually the defaults are here. I'm not going to go through all the setup in IntelliJ, and I do not need Artifactory. This is a holdover from a course in DevOps I was teaching, so I'm going to say next, and it picked up my package name 0.1 snapshot, and I'm going to say next here, and it's looking for a Java JDK. So I'm going to say next here, and it tells me where I am creating that, which is just fine. Project name Hello World, so I'm going to say finished, and IntelliJ is going to open up a new project. Now the process for this is very similar in Eclipse. I am not an Eclipse user. I actually do not care for Eclipse because I've had a number of bad experiences, so I purely use IntelliJ. The development experience is just simply far better, and it just works, and JetBrains is really stands behind their product, so if you ever run into problems, you can get support. So this is the structure that got created. Obviously .idea did not get created from Spring Boot, but we did get the standard Maven directory structure created. Let's take a quick look at the Maven POM, and this was all generated for us from the website start.spring.io, where we can select different options. Now we have a very flat POM here. We only have a couple dependencies that we're looking at. One is the Spring Boot starter, and the other is Spring Boot starter test. So we're only using Spring Boot in this, and we can see it gave us a single class. Yeah, expand this out, and we can see that this is annotated with Spring Boot application. We just have a main method here. And we also have application.properties. This is where we'd set any variable properties that we want to set. And the guys at Spring were nice enough to give us a stub of a test. And all this is going to do is it's annotated with a Spring Runner class for JUnit. JUnit's a very popular unit testing framework. And we're annotating as a Spring Boot test, so Spring Boot is going to fire up the Spring context for us and make sure that it loads. So this is a very simple project, expected to load just no problem at all. Now, I do want to show you one more thing here before we get to this, is dependencies, and this is actually pretty clever what the Spring guys did. So we have the Spring Boot properties, and this is what's bringing in the core Spring jars. And before the day of Spring Boot, you were responsible in figuring out what Spring jars you needed and what projects you wanted to work with. And what Spring Boot gives us is a set of curated dependencies for us to bring in. So we're looking at the starter, and the Spring Boot starter says, oh, I want the Spring Boot context from the 4.3.4 release and get everything matching. And we're going to also do that with logging and make sure that we get the right logging versions for everything to wire up correctly. So pretty handy thing. If you go back before Spring Boot, you had to do all this yourself. So you'd have to include the Spring context just to get this far. So quite a time saver just in managing your project dependencies. And I can close that window. We're going to come back over here to Hello World. And what we want to do is come in here, and IntelliJ has a little shortcut for us to use. We can do is sys out, saves us typing all that, and we're just going to do Hello World. So very simple. And now I can come inside of IntelliJ, right click and say run Hello World, and we can see down at the bottom here it's IntelliJ is making the project, and it's actually going to invoke Maven for us to run this. And we can see that it did start up, and we get our little Hello World as the output. Okay, there is the classic programming example of Hello World. So we now have a Hello World displaying out to the console. And I hope you can see how quick and easy it was to get going with Spring. All we did is we went out to the start.spring.io website and added in a couple parameters. I didn't even need to do that much. I could have just click download and open it up and ran it. But in this case, I did customize it using some traditional conventions, and then brought it into IntelliJ, had the one system out, print line statement, say hello world, ran it, and what happened is Spring started up, and what happened in the background is the Spring context loaded, and Spring looked to see what beans it needed to create, and that's something that we'll get into in the next video, what Spring beans are, and loaded up the context, executed, came across our statement, and then terminated. In this case, it was just a simple program. Now, if we included web, it would have started up Tomcat and stayed in a wait state because it would be running Tomcat. And when we were on the web page, start.spring.io, you saw a lot of different options there. So the Spring Framework family of projects is pretty big, and you have a lot of different options for enterprise application development. And to give you an example, I'm working with a client right now. We are using Spring, we are using Spring Boot. We are also heavily using Spring integration, and we're doing Spring microservices. We're using Gigaspaces, which does have I think it's open source flavor, a free flavor, but we're kind of growing beyond that. And all we're doing is processing healthcare records. So hospitals are making claims to insurers, and we are processing those. We're just a middleman acting between big hospitals and big insurers, and we're kind of standardizing the data as it comes across our rails. But this is a pretty major project that we're working on right now, and in it's so large and open source. We are using OpenShift, which sits on top of Kubernetes, so we're deploying and managing all the microservices within that. So we have effectively cloud computing there. We're using a Gigaspaces space for rapid access to data to help with scalability and speed and performance of this. We're also using a lot of message queuing. So we are using AQMP as Rabbit for all the messaging. As messages come in, we'll be doing that, and we're sending messages out to that. This is all sitting on top of Spring. We have Spring adapters for that with Spring integration. We're also attaching to several databases to persist database as we get to various processing steps. Another thing we're doing is we're calling web services. Some cases they're REST web services, which are cool. Other times they're SOAP web services, which are not as cool as REST. So just to give you an idea of what I mean by an enterprise class application, and Spring is in this across the board, and it has made our lives significantly easier because we're not writing so much code. We're not digging into all these projects. So when we want to persist data, we have Hibernate, and we have Spring Data on top of that. When we're talking to message queues and message flows, Spring integration is the perfect tool for that. When we need to secure something, we have Spring Security. So this is a typical large-scale enterprise application, and I'm telling you about the story because I want you to get an idea of the breadth of the Spring framework. What WordPress is, if you're familiar with WordPress, there's all kinds of plugins and widgets for WordPress's niche. WordPress is an excellent CMS. Spring would probably suck at being a CMS. I wouldn't use Spring for a CMS, not in a WordPress context. If you're running an e-commerce site, Spring is probably a great idea. Actually, there's a couple major e-commerce website vendors using Spring, and they are running top 100 retail sites. And Spring's inside because of the demands that they need. So like I said earlier, back in the 90s when I started this, if you knew Bash and SQL, you were an absolute rock star in the space. But times have definitely changed, and it's a much more complex landscape when you're doing enterprise class application development. And what we're going to get into in the next video in the series is I'm going to show you how to create a website using Spring. We'll go back out to start.spring.io, and we will create a web application this time, and we'll also use Timeleaf, and I'll show you how we can easily create a small web application to fetch data from a database and show it on the screen to our end users.